This video is for students who want a little support in deconstructing historical narratives. And the readings and graphic organizer referenced in this video are going to be from days 6 and 7 of Unit 3. However, the process that we're going to go through is applicable to any content or time period. So let's start by doing a quick review of what a historical narrative is. And in case you haven't looked at it recently, I would definitely reread the text that you see in front of you on the screen, which is titled Writing Historical Narrative, which your teacher made available to you. There is another video available that goes into more detail about what historical narratives are and what makes them unique. And before we go through the process of deconstructing one here in this video, you definitely want to be familiar with what they are. So watching that video or rereading this text in its entirety will definitely give you the foundation that you need. So what you see in front of you is the graphic organizer that was created to help you deconstruct a historical narrative. There are two of them here. The one that we're going to focus on, because again, you did the top one as a model with the teacher. Here's the one that we're going to do as a model right here during this video. And by deconstruct, we mean to break down the historical narrative into its individual components, which allow us to identify and analyze each. So we can then clearly see the parts that make up the whole. And when my own students are writing their first few historical narratives on their own, I suggest to them that they take a blank one of these and use it to help them pre-write and organize their ideas for each of these four categories, which I'm going to go through with you piece by piece right now. So, and I'm just going to zoom in real quick here. So here we see the four components of historical narrative. Historical participants are the individuals or groups of people who are relevant to the moments of action and the plot. Themes, issues, and concepts. These are the historical ideas that were present. So like, for instance, a historical narrative on the civil rights movement of the 1960s might include institutional racism, civil disobedience, and activism in this category. When we say connectives and transitions, we want you to look at the actual words and phrases used by the author in the text that join phrases and sentences together, that show the passage of time, and that allow for the continuity as the story gets told. And these also help the authors establish their scales of time, because as we saw in the first text we read, the writing historical narrative, sometimes several years are covered in just a sentence or two. And for historical thinking, we want you to ask yourself, what is the author presenting to us? And for these last two, connectives, transitions, and historical thinking, I will be sure to point out some very clear examples as we deconstruct a model in just a moment. So let's look at that second narrative from that lesson, the one you read independently, called An Era of Competing Populist Movements by Claire Potter. And you can use my process as a model or to even check your own answers. And to help make things clear, I created a copy of this narrative in Google Docs so that I can color code the elements as we go through. I am now going to model deconstructing this historical narrative. And just so you know, I have read this one before, and when deconstructing one of your own, I highly recommend reading it in its entirety first, then going back and doing the deconstruction. This will allow you to see the big picture of the author's story. So at this point, pause this video and read the historical narrative once on your own, including the context. Okay, so now that you have read it, follow along as I model the deconstruction process. So this historical narrative starts off with the words partisanship and populisms, which are two very important social studies terms that we are going to be seeing, or concepts that we're going to be seeing throughout this reading, that came to characterize the 2010s. We're already coalescing as the ball dropped in Times Square on New Year's Eve 2008. As Barack Obama, and there is our first historical participant, I want to highlight that in red, the first African-American president prepared to take office, disgruntled conservatives and libertarians. I'm going to go ahead and also label them as historical participants because they also play a very big role in this historian's narrative. Began meeting in small community groups, eventually forming the populist Tea Party movement. This is without a doubt an important theme in this narrative. Devoted to limiting the Obama legislative agenda to the expansion of public health care. Now, also up here, as he prepared to take office, That is definitely a connective phrase that the author used. So I'm going to highlight that in green. I know it's broken up, but as Barack Obama prepared to take office. Highlight that in green. Okay. By 2010, there's another connective. Some years went by. It's a transition point for us. Highlight that in green. The Tea Party endorsed candidates were preparing to take their oaths of office in Congress as part of the new Republican House majority. I do think that is a pretty important social studies issue that is relevant to this historian's narrative. By 2013, so you'll notice again, a transition point. As many as 10% of Americans were said to identify with the movement. Now, I think this is, I actually wonder why the historian wrote this here. And like, what was she trying to say to us? And how might this affect the future of the nation, I think is an important question to be asking as we go through. And this entire next sentence is really all about the social studies themes and concepts that were happening during this time period, but on the left side of the political spectrum. So I'm going to also highlight that in orange. And then she starts with another phrase that definitely gives us a transition point. So I'll highlight that in green. Protesters who identified as the Occupy Wall Street movement. Here we have some more participants. Had established a self-governing encampment in Lower Manhattan, protesting economic policies that privileged the 1% over the 99%, forcing issues. Now, these forcing issues, the student debt, workers' rights, climate change, I also think that these would qualify as social studies issues. So I'm going to, again, highlight them in orange. In 2013, here is another transition point. And when we get down to this part about populists who were queer and of color coalesced under the hashtag Black Lives Matter to renew the struggle for racial civil rights, without a doubt, those are some social studies themes and concepts and issues. All right, and then she continues, by the 2016 election, we have another transition point here, and Black Lives Matter. They're also very vital to the movement. So they're definitely historical participants. So I'm going to highlight that in red. Now this next sentence, centrists in both parties suddenly found themselves besieged by new candidates who represented these competing populist movements. What is the author presenting this to us for? And how might this impact the political landscape of the United States? I think this sentence qualifies as a historical thinking component. Then she mentions some more historical participants. We got Bernie Sanders, we have Hillary Clinton, and we also have Donald Trump. All of them were major political participants in this woman's narrative. Now look at this sentence over here where it says, wooing nationalists and corporate America with conspiracy theories and the promise of a country renewed by wealth and whiteness to defeat Clinton in the general election. I think this also shows some historical thinking. And again, ask yourself, why is she presenting it to us like this? And what does this imply about American society? And she wraps up by saying the final 4 years of the decade, that is without a doubt a transition point for us to identify. What's the United States defined by the collapse of the political center, the consequences, and really this whole last sentence really just does give us a lot more social studies issues and concepts that we should be aware of. So I'm going to highlight that one. So there you have it. And again, you may have labeled the components a little differently in your own deconstruction, but really the most important thing is that you see this as a model for as you construct or build a historical narrative of your own.